Hello and welcome to Steelfur Speaks. Got a really exciting topic for you today. We are going to be talking about how well Flesh and Blood has succeeded in capturing the classic fantasy archetypes that are being seen in things like D&D, Pathfinder, and the inspiration for this, the recently reviewed Baldur's Gate 3. Before we get into that, though, I want to do a brief segue into why this isn't called Steelfur Speaks episode 60, why I've moved on to season 2, what I'm calling in my own head Steelfur Speaks 2.0. I really made a decision recently that there needs to be a bit more diversification on my channel. I need to bring in some other voices just to get a bit more of a conversation flowing rather than just you hearing my voice the entire time. So I'm going out, I'm finding, it's going to take a while, finding 2 or 3 regular guests who are going to come on the show. You're going to get used to their voice. We're going to have a great dialogue and we're going to cover more areas of Fab and bring more great Fab content out to you. Coupled with that is this idea that I'm going to be doing a bit more video editing, a bit more work to make sure the sounds are coming across clearer, giving you a bit more polish on the videos, and generally moving into a 2.0. My channel in the Fab sense is now 2.5 years old in terms of overall YouTube work, because I did a lot of Legend of the Five Rings LCG work before Fab came along. My channel is 6 years old, but it's really seen sort of a growth since Fab came around. And I want to acknowledge the difference between where I was when Fab first started and where I've come to now, both in terms of skill as a content creator, but also in terms of like video skills, editing skills, interview skills, all those kind of things. So expect to see some big changes as we move into Steelfur Speaks 2.0. Expect to see new guests and sort of new topics, and this video is one of the first of those. I'm really excited to kick it off with what I think is a fascinating topic, which is the discussion of how fantasy classes are represented in Flesh and Blood and how well we think they've been represented so far and what are the obvious places that are missing. So, like most of you, I have been really sucked into Baldur's Gate 3. I know I'm not alone in that. There are 730,000 other people also playing the game on Steam, and probably loads more as well. I've seen people talking about it across 3 or 4 different Fab servers. And that really made me think, is like, we have all of these classes and subclasses and themes in Dungeons and Dragons. How well are those currently represented in Fab, and where are the gaps that we think Fab still has room to expand into? So let's get into that. So let's dive straight into it. The classes list I've chosen to go with for this is Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. To all you Pathfinder fans out there, I am not ignoring Pathfinder, but it has some that are a bit trickier to look over and justify. Things like the Kineticist and stuff like that. It just makes it a bit stranger. So we're going to go with D&D 5th edition. I think the best place to start, though, with this is to look at the original Fab World Guide, and we're going to say, okay, this was the list they gave to us in the first only real lore book that we've had for Flesh and Blood. What have they crossed off this list so far? And we can see that everything except Alchemist and Cleric and Necromancer have been crossed off the list, right? Now, there is an argument that Assassin covers some of the range of Alchemist because it's all about poisons. And there's arguments that people like Prism and Bolton and those light heroes cover off some of the realms of Cleric in terms of that feeling. Or that it's covered a bit by Guardian and, people like Oldhim and stuff like that who have some kind of magically earth cleric kind of vibes. But really, this is the original list, and it's been said in many interviews that this is not the substantive list of either what classes will be in the game or what classes won't be in the game. This is just a list that went in the original book. But we can see they are making good progress through this list, and it does overlap with your traditional classes from a game like Dungeons & Dragons, but it does not match up entirely. But if we go into the actual Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition class list, so the same sort of thing that you'll see in Baldur's Gate 3. If we look at Baldur's Gate 3, you can see it's almost identical. They are based on the same rule set. So we do have Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. I think the only one that is missing in 5th edition is the Artificer, which of course is an expansion piece of content. And then of course there's Critical Role's Bloodhunter class. So this is really what we have to work with. And the reason that I wanted to cover this topic and the reason I like talking about it is that these are, to me, the default classic fantasy archetypes that should be represented in some way in every game. And also, like, when people are playing throughout their childhood, and this was inspired by Baldur's Gate 3, games like Baldur's Gate, games like Neverwinter Nights, massive game with huge inspiration on me, and they're reading stories about fantasy and things like that. These are the classes that keep coming up again and again and again. And yes, you get strange subclasses that are hard to represent and don't appeal to everyone. Like, one of my old favorite subclasses in Neverwinter Nights was the Shadow Dancer Rogue, because basically it wasn't in the main game, it was in a fan created like add-on to the game, but you could jump out of any shadow that you could see on the screen. As a bonus action, you could just like jump into a shadow and teleport into another shadow, and you basically got a free teleport spell to any shadow, no matter how big it was. As long as it was bigger than your character's height, so like a lamppost shadow, you could just jump out of it, and then you got a sneak attack on anyone you jumped out on in the next round. So you have this really fantastic thematic subclass there. And that's why we keep coming back again and again to these subclasses. You know, you have them in Baldur's Gate, you have them in Dungeons and Dragons. But I guess the question is, we obviously don't need Fab to completely line up with this, but there are fans. I mean, look at me, I'm a massive Druid fan. There are fans of these archetypes that maybe aren't yet served by Flesh and Blood. And it kind of also points to us to gaps in the fantasy archetype that could be served by Flesh and Blood soon. Okay? So, let's go through this video. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go here. We're going to go to our giant tier list maker, and we're going to say, where do the current classes fit in terms of traditional archetypes, including the most commonly known subclasses, right? And then, once we've done that, then we're going to turn to the question of what hasn't been covered. So once we've said, okay, well, this feels kind of like a barbarian, this feels kind of like a fighter, what hasn't been covered? Where are the gaps, right? Because ultimately that's what we're looking to find in these videos. And I think there's going to be some really interesting subclasses that haven't yet been explored in Flesh and Blood that could potentially make their way into the game. And this isn't just one giant advert for the Druid class. Come on, give me a Druid, but you know, it isn't. It's a, what can we explore and where are things going to go? So we're going to do this first, and then we're going to go into each of the classes, and we're going to say, what is this subclass? And also we're going to say, what would that look like mechanically, right? A lot of this video stemmed from a discussion with a friend of mine as to what a Spore Druid could look like from Baldur's Gate 3 if it ended up in Flesh and Blood. And we had lots of fun ideas for that, and I thought, well, we can do that on a grander scale and do that. So let's start, right? So we've got the heroes all here, young to old, and let's see where they fit in. So starting first with Assassin, I think Assassin is actually potentially the easiest one to put in anywhere, right? Assassin is a rogue. All of the Assassins are rogues. They attack with daggers. They trick people into doing big attacks, sneak attacks, which, you know, if they have an advantage, i.e. they have 2 cards in hand, they apply poisons and toxins, which is a very common rogue subclass feature. You know, that is just basically Assassin. The only part of the rogue kind of archetype that Assassin don't really cover is the defensive side, so the ability to hide and dodge attacks. They are very much the aggressive rogue. But if you look at the Assassin subclass in D&D, you will see then that most of the options are covered. You know, you have, you know, infiltration, the ability to assassinate if you get to attack at the right time. There is a little bit of an area that could be explored in terms of like imposters, like that kind of like death strike, like attacks people can't recover from, or like permanent negative bonuses if certain conditions are met. But I feel like for the most part, we've kind of got Assassin well represented. There are other areas the rogue could go to, but we'll talk about that later. I think we'll talk about all of those kind of subclasses we haven't explored later. So moving on then, we have Rhinar coming in. Now Rhinar, I'm sure, is in here once or twice, but this is young Rhinar, who kind of has the same ability as old Rhinar. Now, there's an obvious place to put Rhinar, which is straight into the Barbarian class. You know, He discards cards at random. He has a bit of a rage. He gets aggression. He is pretty much just your straight standard barbarian. But I will say that through, the random discard effects, there are hints of sort of like the wild magic barbarian. There are hints of that if things and the stars align, then I get way more power. So putting him in the barbarian feels right. But also, he does have that element of randomness, kind of the wild magic barbarian kind of vibe. There's also an argument, maybe, that Rhinar goes down into the monk category, just in terms of the fact that, like, he does use claws and fist-based weapons. He is kind of that, I'm going to hit you, and I'm going to hit you as hard as I can, and, it's not always going to, be something you can deal with. But I feel like Monk implies a little bit more of what we were talking about in terms of, like, disruption, a little bit more on hit effects, a little bit more kind of like, this is going to affect you for a while kind of vibe. So I think he probably really just fits nice and cleanly into the barbarian archetype. So I think we can put him there. I will say, like, there is a possibility, just based on how Rhinar cards keep interacting with animals in the art, that we could see Brute branch out into kind of like a druidic animal companion style. I would be disappointed if Brute goes to Druid rather than Druid coming in as a class, but we could see, because there are animals featured in so many of the Brute cards, that he could go into an animal companion style of play, but I don't think we're going to be there yet. Azalea, Ranger is a pretty well-established archetype, isn't she? So, you're firing arrows, you're poisoning them if you need to, you're setting a few traps. Ranger, in my mind, is actually one of the archetypes that feels just the cleanest transplant from traditional fantasy into D&D, into Flesh and Blood. And we can see that being acknowledged and responded to by the community in the way that there are so many people who are just Ranger fans, because they probably have liked that archetype of that arrow shooting tracker hunter for many, many years. And that has been crystallized into Azalea and the other Rangers in a way that really makes them appreciate and just stick to that class. Kind of in the same way we got a similar vibe to the response from the Assassin. There's lots of people who are fans of Rogue and those roguish Assassin archetypes who, the second that Assassin was announced, were like, yeah, that's my hero, I'm straight in there. Okay? Then we have Ninja. So, in my mind, we can talk about the other ninjas in a bit, but Ninja is kind of like in this middle ground between Monk and Rogue, where Benji really representing that monk style of ninja gameplay, where it's, I'm going to punch you, and then I'm going to punch you again and again and again. And it's kind of like that flurry of fists, multiple strikes, flurry of blows, bonus attacks, all this kind of stuff really comes together to just overwhelm their opponent with loads of little punches, right? Now, if we think about other ninjas, Ira kind of fits more into a rogue archetype, where it's, I'm setting up, here's one attack, and then here's the big attack, right? Kind of feels a bit more like Assassin, where there's a bit more calculated planning of, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. Katsu in some ways feels the same, but I still feel like he represents Monk a bit more, because he, in many ways, is doing this kind of like boxing style in my mind, where he's fishing with these small attacks, the 0 for 3s and things like that. And when he hits you, then there's the combo that comes in. So it's like that first punch is just opening the way, and then it's following into kind of this like way of the open palms, follow-up kicking and punching style, right? So whereas Ira kind of feels like she could be more set up, because her ability is so simple, she kind of feels like she's more rogue, more flexible in that way. The fact that Katsu requires these initial hits and then follows them up with a big follow-on punch really just starts to feel Monk to me in a huge way. Then we've got Bolton. I don't think anyone's going to disagree here. Where do we just put Bolton? Just go straight into Paladin, right? There's an argument maybe that he goes into Fighter, or maybe comes some kind of like War Domain Cleric, but really I think he's an easy Paladin, right? He's got light-based attacks, he's got light-based swords. What is a Paladin except someone that hits you with a sword? He's got healing, he's got invocations and blessings from the gods. He charges his soul to do better attacks. Like, he is archetypally just a straight Paladin. And I will say this, like, if you consider Bolton's performance, in the world of Flesh and Blood to date, he's not actually very, very good, but he has these really stalwart fans who are just completely and utterly dedicated to him. And one of the reasons for that is his clear paladin archetyping. There are people who absolutely adore paladin, much like they adore ranger, who literally just latched on to Bolton. And that's kind of a theme we'll talk about fully at the end of this video, is that where this has succeeded, and these archetypes are successfully coming through, and they line up with traditional fantasy archetypes, those heroes have seen drastic popularity with people just really buying into them, right? And there's a reason that there are barbarian players who only play Brute, right? And paladin players who only play Bolton. Where those have succeeded, they're really crazy. So then we've got Bravo. Now, Bravo kind of feels a bit paladin to me. He feels, a bit paladin in the sense that his attacks kind of have something extra added on. You have a bit of divine smite. If I hit you hard enough with my divine smite, then you get this penalty. But I think we could feel kind of comfortable just putting him in the fighter category. Bravo, in my mind, is sort of like a battle master fighter, where every attack is like, if I roll well on this, or if it hits you, then suddenly all my allies have advantage. If I do this thing, then you're distracted and my next attack is going to be even better. If I set up, in some way and leave you overextended. So Bravo to me is that battle master fighter archetype where he's causing his opponent to be at a disadvantage. But also, I guess he has the capability of being that kind of like war cleric, that protection cleric where they have big shields and massively defensive. Fighters can do that as well. They just typically don't, because people in D&D are damage obsessed. Oddly enough, Stavro I put in the sorcerer field. Stavro is like, if the hands line up, I have these amazing explosive turns. He could also even be like Warlock. Like, if everything comes together, my Eldritch Master grants me a massive pact boon. I really don't think he fits the same sort of calculated playstyle as, a fighter does. He's really kind of like, I brought all this stuff together and it worked for me. So I actually put Stavro straight in the sorcerer category. I think that makes the most sense for him. This next part makes me sad because I really want to put Briar. I know she's not a druid, but I really want to put her in the druid style. I think she has the natural theme, the natural theme associated with her. She has all this like elemental power. She's buffing herself. She's bringing a bit of like magic into her attacks as well, which is a really like Runeblade thing to do. But Runeblade does kind of feel like druid to me in some ways, and in other ways it feels like cleric. Now, there's an argument that Runeblade either goes in cleric or it goes in warlock. Like, Runeblade is just a classic Pact to the Blade warlock where they're attacking you with their weapons and their swords, but every so often they're just shooting this massive eldritch blast at your face. But I actually think that Runeblade does just go in the cleric field, right? They have just enough magic to get by, and we're not talking about life domain, right? Obviously, there is an argument that we'll get a life domain cleric, but if you think about the classic cleric archetypes, you have the ones that are focused on, like, we're doing a bit more magic than paladins and a bit less attacking than paladins, but when we get our attacks lined up, we get good stuff, right? Because you could also probably put Runeblade into the paladin category quite well. I think it crosses a lot of archetypes, but actually, I put Briar up into the cleric. I think she has enough magic and things that keep things interesting, but she is still primarily focused on attack. She is a very much like war cleric vibes. She isn't doing healing, but her embodiments of earth kind of feel like a cleric guidance healing kind of spell, so that kind of makes sense, right? Chain just goes straight into warlock. Anyone disagrees with me? I mean, he's literally made a pact with an eldritch being. We can just chuck Vincent. Vincent is not on this list. Great, good. Okay, well, Vincent is not on this, but if Vincent was here, she would be in Warlock as well. You are literally sacrificing things to your Eldritch God to get your rewards. Thank you very much. Open book, book shut. A little bit of magic, little bit of sword, probably like a Hexblade Warlock kind of feel. Viserai, we'll just do him now, kind of goes in there as well. Though, I will say, if you're playing like more of a rune chant focused build, there's an argument that he goes in sorcerer or something like that. But I feel like warlock just makes sense for these three, because not only thematically have they all either been forced into or made a pact with some powerful being, but, you know, they haven't done things. Maybe I have made a little bit of an oversight. We probably should actually have the Artificer class in, because because obviously next up is just a open and shut case of straight into Artificer, right? Just putting Dash just 100% straight into Artificer, and there's no reason not to do that, right? She has items, she attacks. There is a bit of an element of like a fighter with like some, you know, the way that she boosts, she's kind of like driving herself forward to attack, using like stored energy to do these kind of things. So there is elements of like paladin and fighter in there. Like boosting feels a bit divine smitey. Oh, every time I attack, I'm going to spend this resource to do a bit more. You know, that kind of feels like divine smite. But I think Artificer is the only class that Mechanologist really fits in. Data Doll, yeah, she can go up there as well. I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about Data Doll. Dorinthia, there's 3 Dorinthias. Let's just put her straight into the fighter category. She's a great weapon master fighter. She only cares about fighting. And if she rolls, you know, if she uses great weapon fighting, she's going to roll a 25, take off 10, still hit you and just smack your face off with an axe, right? You know, she's just 100% clean weapon-based fighter. She doesn't have that paladin overtone that I feel like Bolton does with the soul charging and things like that. So I think she fairly quickly fits in there. Then we have a weird one, which is Dromai. And this is where we start to think that maybe the guys who, you know, like Flesh and Blood aren't D&D players, and they might actually be Pathfinder players, or even maybe like traditional Final Fantasy players, because Dromai is a summoner, like 100%. If you've played any Final Fantasy games or Pathfinder or anything like that, she's a summoner. And really then the only place that we can actually put her, which I think is quite amusing, to me at least, is into the Druid category. So if we're thinking about just traditional D&D archetypes, Dromai is the Circle of Shepherds Druid. Dromai is a druid focused on summoning and buffing her allies and minions. She is a Circle of Shepherds druid who's just fully focused on summoning dragons. But, you know, in your actual D&D game, that would just be a thematic thing, right? She'd actually be summoning the usual sort of spiders and wolves and all the pixies that turn into Tyrannosaurus Rexes. Or I think that's the hack that exists in D&D, is you summon a load of pixies who can cast polymorph, and then they cast polymorph and turn themselves into dinosaurs, and then you have 6 summoned dinosaurs. But Dromai is that, right? She's a Circle of Shepherds druid. It makes me sad because we need druid in the game, but she is the closest thing to that summoner archetype of druid. Also, of course, you know, we have ranger as a summoner archetype in a lot of games. But I will say this, that ranger usually focuses on a single animal companion, whereas other archetypes like druid or even necromancer in the wizard focus on summoning a lot of different things. I will say that the fact that she is not summoned, like she's not using graveyard recursion except for burn them all, really means she doesn't fit into the necromancer archetype. So I would say she is closest to the druid, but you could also, you know, if you were just adding another category, you could add summoner, and that would kind of cover things off. But for now, I think she goes in Circle of Shepherd druid, pretty clean up there. The Emperor is a warrior wizard. I mean, he's a bit weird. We're going to put him in wizard so we don't have to think about him too much. Fi fits pretty cleanly into the monk category as well. Lots of small attacks, buffing them if they hit, buffing for doing more attacks. You know, like if my 5th punches hit you, it's going to deal more. He's pretty clean into the monk category. Merchants, why are merchants? Merchants, let's not worry about merchants. Icelander, pretty easy to categorize. She is just an ice wizard casting Frost Orb or Frozen Orb or Blizzard. There is an argument, this is where spellcasting in D&D gets a bit confusing, that she could also be, you know, a Tempest-born sorcerer, or she could be a Circle of land Arctic Druid where she casts just a load of things. And actually, when I think about how specialized she is, I might even feel better putting her into like a Circle of Land focused Druid, because wizards are kind of about specialization into multiple schools of magic. But I think there's enough room in sort of fantasy archetypes for the idea of a cryomancer, of like an Arctic focused wizard. So I think we can just put her there and be happy. Kano as well is the same. He's just fire focused, very clear wizard. Though there is an argument for sorcerer. And I will say this, that whereas Icelander has other elements to her magic in that she can control people with frost, and she's clearly got frost hexes and other sort of really complex, arcane work that persists and sticks around. Kano is very much, I'm tutoring the top of my deck, and if it's great, I'm going to blow you up. Like, to me, pitching with Kano feels like spending a sorcery point. So it's why I actually would put Kano in the sorcerer category rather than the wizard category, which seems a bit silly because of his class, but I actually think he does belong there. So there's an argument that Icelander could be like an Arctic focused specialized Circle of Land Druid, and there's an argument that Kano is a sorcerer, right? Kasai is a fighter, right? She's just a fighter. She's a dual-wielding fighter. She might even be like a dual-wielding rogue or a bard, but I feel like fighter makes a lot of sense. She's got good armor. She's got attacks. Kavdane is a warlock, I think. He's making pacts. He's doing deals. He's sucking people's energy out. No, we are not going to slide into Google Drive. Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll just put KO straight up there into Barbarian. That's spelled wrong. He's rolling dice. He's a wild magic barbarian. That's fine. Levia, unlike the other brutes, actually just goes straight into Warlock, right? Because, she's random a bit, right? She's random a bit, but she's made a pact with an Eldritch being, just like the other Shadow heroes, and she's sacrificing some parts of herself to get that power. Now, arguably, there's room for Levia as a necromancer wizard, because she eats her graveyard to fuel her power. That's actually a pretty strong theme that comes through. And there's also arguments, I guess, to put her in like a Circle of Death cleric kind of place. Not druid, sorry, cleric kind of place, where she's spending the resources of death to do things, because she can heal herself, she can do powerful attacks, but she also has some other like flexibility. I still think she does kind of fit best in the warlock category, despite the fact that she's just focused on attacking. But it's a bit of a tricky one. She's a bit of a tricky one. I think she crosses over a few different areas. Warlocks do have this room for like transmogrification, hexblades, kind of like actual attacking theme, which does make room for a class like Levia, but it's not really that established. So actually, I might put Levia, I think I'm more comfortable with Levia in the cleric category. She's spending the resources of death to do big attacks on her Warhammer, kind of like big swings. She's not really, she's made a pact, but it's more with her deity, who she kind of ends up either overcoming or making a better deal with. It kind of feels a bit better than the pacts that Chain and Viserai have made. Lexi's a pretty clean ranger. Just multi-attack ranger with magic arrows that do things on hit. There's an argument for putting her into like a monk or a ranged like rogue fighter archetype, but I think we can just leave her in ranger as a pretty comfortable place for her to be. Oldhim is interesting. So on the surface, he's a fighter, right? He's like Bravo. But actually, when you think about how he uses the sword and shield combo and like how he is so defensive, I think we actually find more room for him in either the cleric or the paladin class, where he's got his sword and his shield, but he's also got this magic. He's got this little bit of control. He's got this little bit of power. And we're kind of just sitting there being like, okay, so that feels like he has more to him than just being very, very good with a sword and shield, right? Which is where we kind of find our fighter archetype is I'm so good with a weapon that I can make it do amazing things. In Bravo's case, it's I'm so good with swinging my hammer, I can make it control you next turn what you do, right? The Battle Master fighter. And Dorinthia is that great weapon fighter. I'm so good with this sword, it's going to hit you really, really hard when everything lines up. But Oldhim isn't that. He's layered. He's got more options. He is more defensive. He has more focus on healing, though they don't always get played. You know, so he really does fit more into that cleric kind of style, which is quite interesting. Then we have Prism. She kind of, again, like Dromai, fits into the summoner class. She kind of fits a bit into the wizard class in terms of the fact that she can summon illusory magic, so kind of like that illusion school of wizard. And that makes it a bit tricky to decide where to place her. I actually feel that she probably fits up here into the cleric style, because one side of clerics are all focused on these concentration spells that, if they can maintain them, have massive impacts on the battlefield. So we're talking about guidance, we're talking about holy weapon, we're talking about all of those kind of things. And to me, that is Prism. So Prism is kind of like a concentration focused cleric. When she gets all of her things together, she really has control over the battlefield, powered through her magic, right? Then we have Rhinar again. Then we have Riptide. Riptide just fits nicely into the Ranger archetype. He could be a bit of a crossover with Rogue because of all the traps. Shiana is not eligible because she is a shapeshifter, though I guess she does just fit into the Druid because she's a shapeshifter and she can do a lot of different things. Azuri goes nicely into Rogue, again, just like Arachne does. There is just a Rogue thing going on there. Valda is more of a fighter like Bravo, I would say. She's not really... She's just very good at hitting people. And Yoji is definitely a fighter as well. So that's it. I mean, obviously we have Vincent. Vincent is probably in the Warlock area too. But that's our initial estimation. There is obviously a Bard as well. But, you know, we know that Yorick only really explores the I'm buffing my friend singing happy songs style. That can be Yorick. Yorick can be Young Bravo for now because they're both at the Everfest festival. So, you know, we only really have that one view of Yorick, which is buffing your party. There's also adjudicators and things like that, which we're not really going to go into. So you can see that there is actually a decent spread over the different fab, like, hero archetypes from classical fantasy, with some... Let's just change the colours to the ones I think that have been really well explored, and we'll cover the ones that aren't in a different colour. So the ones that haven't really been explored yet, Artificer has a lot of room to grow, but we're getting a whole set dedicated to that, so that might not be a problem. I feel like Barbarian has a lot of ways to go. It's a bit tricky, right? Because Barbarian fills the same class role in a lot of parties as the fighter. So he's a big attacker, he's very tanky, he kind of does those things. So the aspects of Barbarian that have been explored are the random aspects of, like, the wild magic Barbarian to an extent. But I think Barbarian could go further, and I think in the next video we'll probably talk about how it would be really fun to get some other effects into Brute that are a bit random, like arcane damage or summoning or something like that happens if you roll a certain dice number. Things like, you know, that make it more random effects that are harder to plan for and give Brute a bit more diversity of what's actually going on the board and really capture that kind of wild magic vibe. So I think Barbarian has some room to explore. Bard has a lot of room left to explore. That's definitely a yellow. Right, orange is pending, because I think Artificer is going to be very well explored by the end of Bright Lights. Yellow is kind of well explored. Cleric is very well explored, but there's so much in Cleric that we haven't really seen everything that could come out of Cleric. But I still think it's a green. Druid gets... Ooh, I want to give it a red because I feel like Dromai is just a summoner, and I feel like she's not actually a druid. I feel we could just move Dromai out of there, and I feel like she's not actually a druid. She's just more of a summoner archetype. And I feel like while some of the druid has been explored by Briar, I don't feel like we've explored enough of the druid class. And also, this is my own bias coming in, but I don't feel like I'm going to be satisfied until there is a druid class in the game. So I'm going to put a little personal bias there and say hasn't really been explored. I feel like Fighter as an archetype has been quite well explored, so that gets a green, both in terms of like Bravo and Dorinthia doing the Battlemaster plus Great Weapon Fighter. We could have room for an Eldritch Knight, but I guess that is Viserai, so the magic fighting warrior style is kind of Runeblade down to a T, so that's kind of been explored very well. The only real area, I guess, is the mounted combat, but that's harder to capture in a game where you don't need horses. And also, if you're going to add in like a horse animal mechanic, it fits much better into like Barbarian or bringing in a Druid class rather than giving like a mounted fighter kind of thing. One thing we could see explored a bit more is this whole like Blade Dancer kind of thing where, you know, where we have a character that does attacks that give them bonuses on their opponent's turn or let them dodge or, you know, other things that kind of carry over to create this more of a flow of combat like the Blade Dancer likes to, but that is covered a little bit by Ninja. Then we've got Monk. Monk could go into the direction of debuffs and things like that. There are a lot of areas that Monk could explore, so I think that gets a yellow, though I feel like the punch of Monk is well explored. Paladin is weird because Bolton explores it very well, but it's hard to separate light from Paladin, right? So we're not going to get more light heroes. We've had a lot of light heroes exploring that whole like how does light interact archetype. What are we going to see from Paladin that is different from light, right? And how, if they went to say for an Oathbreaker Paladin or something like that, is that going to be different from just like a Runeblade? Or, you know, like a Shadow Brute. Like one of the places we could have put Levia is in the Oathbreaker Paladin archetype, right? She's someone who was good, who swore a pact, forsook her, you know, vows, and now is spending those credits she's gained with her new evil deity to do massive attacks with her big sword, right? So she could actually just fit in there, and actually maybe that's a better place for her than Cleric, is into the Oathbreaker archetype, right, in the Paladin class. So that's actually kind of explored to a yellow extent, but that's partly just because I personally don't feel that Paladins have a lot of depth when it comes to this style of game. They have a lot of depth when it comes to like full role play, and there's lots of talking involved because obviously you have different approaches to Paladins, like the one who cares more about nature and all the squirrels, and you have the ones that care more about, you know, doing the right thing and helping the person they think is right, even if they get it wrong sometimes, and you have all those different complex role-playing aspects. But really, when it comes to combat, Paladin is about hitting people with a stick, right? Hitting people with a big sword, smiting them a bit, doing a bit of magic. So we could see more like healing focused or like light focused, but that's going to be kind of Cleric vibes. So Paladin's kind of well explored. Ranger, I think Ranger's very well explored. We've got I fire big, powerful arrows that do a lot of control and have other on-hit effects. I poison my arrows and treat them with stuff Ranger. We've got the I fire lots of arrows that have elemental powers Ranger, and we have the I do loads of traps, which could be a rogue, but Ranger works for that. So really the only thing we haven't had explored is kind of like a, you know, animal companion focused Ranger or a more like tracking focused Ranger with Hunter's Mark and stuff like that. But I feel like that archetype could fit easily just as well into the Monk or, you know, into another class. So I don't feel like it necessarily needs to be in that. And I feel like there's obviously overlap between Ranger and Rogue when we start thinking about melee attack Rangers and things like that. So I think that's pretty good. Rogue feels quite well explored. We've got stealth, we've got contracts, we've got assassins. You know, this is covering the ranged Rogue fighting style, you know, quite well. So I feel like Rogue is very well explored too. You've also got the fact that Ninja kind of feels like Rogue to a certain extent when you're stabbing people with your weapons and stuff. We could get a more like weapon focused assassin, you know, but then equally that's kind of like Kasai. So it feels like Rogue is very well established. The only thing really, I think, well, no, I was going to say we're missing Swashbuckler, but actually if you think about Swashbuckler Rogue, well, then we've got Dorinthia right there. So the only thing we're actually missing from Rogue, I think, is that kind of like trickster charm, which we might start to see from a bard character, where it's like offering your opponents, you know, a reason not to attack you, or like persuading them, or like chancing their way out of situations or picking their pockets. So those kind of archetypes still to be explored. But I feel like Rogue is quite well explored. Sorcerer and Wizard are always going to be confusing, right? We could have more stuff like Stavro, where if the stars align, they get really powerful effects, or maybe they have a limited number of effects that they can spend during the game, so they have actual sorcery points. But for the moment, Sorcerer feels like, to an extent, it's well explored, and that's partly because we've got Ice and Fire. We've got the two main traditional Wizard and Sorcerer archetypes. It would be fun to see kind of like a Tempest, like Storm focused, maybe building, ramping over time with items on the board rather than the Icelander one, which builds to a combo. You have one that's kind of like ramping thunder damage or lightning damage or something, little pings and things like that. That's a bit of an area to explore. Warlock feels somewhat explored. Like, these are pacts, these are powerful eldritch incantations. We haven't really got the summoning side of Warlock, but again, that could come out in a Druid or that could come out in a Brute kind of style, but it feels like it's reasonably well explored. And Wizard feels reasonably well explored. What we don't have yet, which I think we might get to, is that generic Wizard that can do a lot of different things with magic. Currently, the goal is set up a big turn that can kill you, or set up a big turn that can freeze you and then kill you. And that's the only way that Wizard can win. But we kind of see implications from like the Mind Warp, those new cards that came out that have bonuses if you do more arcane damage, that there might be a Wizard that actually has a bit more fun with arcane magic rather than just trying to either melt them with fire or freeze them with ice. So there could be room for those to expand. So that's our initial discussion of sort of where these classes are in relation to in relation to Flesh and Blood. If you have a favorite class, I'd be really keen to hear about it in the comments. And also, if you've liked this video, do subscribe. They always say about 60% of the people who watch videos do not actually have that subscription button turned on. I would really appreciate more subscribers to let me know I'm doing a good job. So if you've liked this video and you're still listening, you definitely give me a subscribe. And yeah, that was it. Next in this series, we're going to go into a bit more of the areas I think aren't explored yet. We're going to dive a bit more into some of the interesting sub-archetypes, both official and unofficial, that I think could be explored in Flesh and Blood. We're also especially going to spend a bit of time talking about how the Druid could be implemented in Flesh and Blood, because you think that is one of the classes I really feel just is not explored in any real capacity. We're also going to look a bit more into the other archetypes that aren't explored that much and see how I think they could be represented. Right, so there we go. The classes that are really well explored: Cleric, Fighter, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer. Obviously, there's some that aren't yet. We'll talk about that next time. Thank you all for listening. I'll speak to you all soon. Have a good one.